If you're having trouble finding the room, you probably can't hear me. Welcome. All right. So, yeah, very happy to be here at EAAI. I am here representing the 2025 AAAI EAAI Patrick Henry Winston Outstanding Educator Award. And I'm here representing my committee co-chairs, Ayanna Howard and Charles Isbell. All right, so I want to give a little bit of background about the award before we actually turn the microphone over to the award winner, who's going to give you a talk. It's a big secret, and the reason you know it's a big secret is because his name is written outside on the wall. So I'm trying to build up the suspense here. All right, so the award itself was actually created in 2016. I feel like along with deep learning, and it was created to honor a person or group of people who have made major contributions to AI education with long-lasting benefits to the AI community and society. And it's really intended to be very broad, and I want to encourage everybody here, especially when I read this list of examples, of people that you're thinking of in the community who could be deserving recipients of this award. We're going to be the co-chairs again this coming year, and we absolutely welcome your nominations. Either, if there's somebody you can think of, nominate that person, or arm twist somebody else to nominate that person. There's many ways of wielding power. All right, so the sorts of things that we hope to, oh yeah, why don't you hold on? There's lots of different ways that a person can make significant contributions to the AI education community. For example, creating innovative teaching methods, service to the AI education community, generating pedagogical resources, designing curricula, and educating students even outside of higher education venues, including the general public, about AI topics. The winner, as a kind of incentive to nominate people that you'd like to honor, will receive and does receive a certificate and a $1,000 honorarium that's split among all the various winners. In addition, a complimentary one-year AAAI membership, either new or renewal, and a complimentary conference registration to the conference. For those who don't know, Patrick Henry Winston, for whom the award is named, was a pioneering and beloved AI educator, spent 50 years teaching Intro to Artificial Intelligence at MIT. So you can imagine among the 10,000-ish students who were in those classes, a lot of very influential AI contributors were there. He created an early and influential AI textbook. His introduction to AI lectures on MIT OpenCourseWare are extremely influential. And he's done touched a lot of people's lives by creating lectures on thinking and communicating clearly, including a well-known talk called How to Speak, which is a thing that is really worth watching. It really is. He does a remarkable job of kind of getting that idea across. All right, so I think we're ready to announce the winner. Subrao Kambapati from Arizona State University for innovative teaching of AI and machine learning. I got this right off of the web, through online courses reaching many thousands of students through creative, entertaining. Okay, that was the award that we won last year, but it was on the website for a little while and then was replaced by this. All right. For broad and sustained engagement with the public on AI and its societal impact, developing widely used AI teaching materials, and being an inspirational educator, mentor, and thought leader in AI. So I want to say a little bit, let's actually first congratulate Ralph. And we would like to draw attention to a couple of the things that were mentioned in the nomination letter for Rao that we thought were particularly noteworthy. So I'm just going to flag a couple of these for everybody. He's created a number of timely and instructive tutorials, including this tutorial from the ICML conference on understanding the role of large language models in planning. But he's been just wonderful in terms of whenever there's a topic that's hot and interesting and he knows about it, he makes sure to put together a tutorial to get other people on board, to get other people involved in that area. And I think that's just a remarkably valuable thing to do. He has a widely shared set of AI lecture videos, including this alpha beta example that actually was viewed by something like 30,000, or more than 300,000 people, right, have actually watched this. Is that funny? I thought that's kind of awesome. Something happening in the shadow. All right. All right, great. And he has a highly followed social media account with over 23,000 followers. And you can see he follows 75 people. So this is a very asymmetric relationship that we have with Rao. And I didn't know this. So I'm now in the Washington area. And so I didn't know about The Hill. It's a publication. But he's been writing a column on AI for a number of years. And I think I've read every single one of the columns that he's written. And it's just great to see how he's able to lay out what's going on in the AI field in a way that's meaningful and hype-free and interesting. Oh gosh, I should really wrap this up. I'm so sorry. But let me just say that now that I got to Washington, D.C., I've still never heard of The Hill. But I did love all the essays that he wrote. And so without any further ado, we would like to turn this microphone over to Rao so that he can give his presenting talk, his invited talk. Thank you, Rao.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thanks, Charles. Thank you. Okay, you can hear me now? Yep. Okay, great, thank you. Thank you all for coming. I mean, don't believe one word about AGI being around the corner. Nobody other than people could have found this secret room by 2 o'clock after lunch. Seriously, ChatGPT is somewhere still in SFO. Thank you for coming. Thank you for taking the time to come to this talk. And I also want to thank Smoo and Curly, Michael Littman and Charles Isbell for coming here. I think it's almost as interesting that these guys are here as that I got this award. Thank you very much. So let me talk a little about what I'm going to do today. So first of all, I tell my students, I mean, this is a AI DVB thing, that I tell my students that the most interesting thing about people is not their transition function, but their reward function. It's not what their capabilities are, but what makes them happy. That's most of the important things that when I see people, I try to understand their reward metric. And let me tell you my reward metric. My reward metric has always had extremely high premium for teaching. I come from a family of teachers. My father is a teacher, my father-in-law is a teacher, my wife is a teacher, my brother is a teacher, my sister-in-law is a teacher, my other brother-in-law is also a teacher. And also, more importantly, when I was a kid, when other people would be playing more interesting games, such as playing doctor, if you get my drift, I was playing teacher. I would basically get people around and teach them stuff. So honestly, it's like beautiful, I think, to be told that you have a modicum of talent in the direction of your earning. And so for that, I want to thank you all for this honor. So, but teaching is not a solitary activity. There may be some solitary activities. Research sometimes is. For some people, teaching certainly is not a solitary activity. And so I have to start by thanking the generations of people I tormented with my quote-unquote teaching, starting with my brother and sister who say they still are scarred for my attempts to teach them. By the way, the middle guy is me, the taller guy. So now they're taller than me probably, but anyway. And then also my poor son, whom I tried to teach, he still wound up being fine. He's 28 years old now, but obviously maybe he has some anger still towards the whiteboard. And of course, the generations of students that I had the chance to mentor as well as teach in the classroom. These are some of my research students that got together impromptu without, to my surprise, on my 60th birthday. Yeah, I know, I am 60 and over. So they're all my students, and that's I want to really thank them. And this is the most recent cohort of my current students. Okay, that's about thanks, and there are two parts that I'm going to do today. The agenda basically is a very small, maybe not too small, but maybe like a few minutes of a brief introduction to my teaching adventures, followed by some thoughts on teaching AI in these amazingly exciting times. One of the things that makes intro AI in general and AI in particular so interesting is every time you teach it, it's a different course. It's not like classical mechanics, which hasn't really changed that much. And so it's kind of a beautiful, and I haven't taught of intro AI 50 times the way Patrick Winston apparently has taught, but I taught, over 30 years, and I find it exciting just because every time I teach, it's an interesting excitement. And so I want to share some technical as well as, interesting perspectives about what I find useful, that it might be of use to you too, because we are, after all, this is EAAI, and so we are interested in sort of educating the students and the public about AI. And then, of course, hopefully, time for questions. I do want to say that I did actually read my very first intro to AI course in 1982 at Indian Institute of Technology, Madras, with this guy, Ignarana, from Patrick Henry Winston's book. And I got to tell you, I was electrical engineering major, and it's so easy to walk through Patrick Winston's book because he didn't believe in equations, and it was a very nicely written book, but it was like a different era, different kind of AI. But it really did catch my attention in terms of the goals that the field has set for itself. And then for the last, God knows, 33 years, 7 months, I have been a professor at Arizona State University. I try to do my own stand-up comedy for my students, which is part of the reason why I love Michael and Charles, because, look, we only have one life. You might as well have fun with it. And so I really enjoy, doing what I do in front of the students. So that stand-up comedy involved, generations of intro to AI classes, and which keep changing every time. And also, as Michael pointed out, a whole bunch of tutorials that I've done. The first one was like, I think 2000 or 1999 and 2000. The second one was 2015. The third one was 2019. And the fourth one, this one is last year, 2024. There are a bunch of other tutorials, but I like it. I actually find, as I said, that's my reward. If I understand something, I want to explain it to somebody else, and that's my reward metric. And then, of course, I also did some of these, teach people how to talk, teach people how to write papers kind of a thing. Wittgenstein's papers and Faraday's talks. Maxims for a milk-fed researcher was a IJCAI 2013 tutorial that I think has still more or less stood the test of time in terms of how to write papers and tutorials. My students seem to like it. Some of them even write like poems. This poem was written way before ChatGPT, so that they actually tried to rhyme something or other. And then, I have like a embarrassingly kind comments from the students, and that keeps me going. I got a bunch of teaching excellence awards, and some of them tried to even stop me from talking by saying, this is your last lecture, do the last lecture and we're done with it. That was in 2011. Clearly they didn't succeed because I'm here still talking. And then, of course, people wrote very nice. I like this thing that somebody wrote, that I try to kind of make classes sort of non-linear so that people actually, the most important thing is for the people to be awake, because if you're awake, you might learn something. If you're asleep, very little can be learned. So I do that anyway, and that was all fine. That was my teaching stuff, right? Then a phase started where I started getting involved in AAAI. I can make AI great again. Oh, by the way, I do want to say don't any of you think that I'm somehow wearing this stuff for diversity? I'm not interested in any diversity, just for high fashion. So please don't squeal on me that I wore something for diversity. Anyway, so AAAI, I ran for AAAI presidency and I somehow got elected. And then I thought basically, well, this is normally talking, maybe looking at internal things, and I do a few things. Nobody cares about AI still anyway, even in 2014. And then I went to, I remember actually I was in MIT that day, and I saw this thing saying Elon Musk is talking in the MIT Aero Astros 100th or 150th anniversary, God knows how long. And then I thought, oh, it would have been nice to go, but I couldn't go obviously because it was sold out, etc. And then I forgot about it. I come back and I find that this thing has hit the airwaves. He apparently, out of nowhere, when somebody asked him what keeps him awake, he said, I were to guess that our biggest existential threat is probably artificial intelligence. And as soon as that happened, kaboom, right? Basically, it's no longer presidency, which involves essentially taking care of account books. It was a lot more outward facing. I wound up going around places. I actually do have an IMDb page. None of you have IMDb pages. I have an IMDb page. My rank has been falling down. I don't know why, but and then, that's India's External Affairs Minister, and this is Roosevelt Room with Tom Michel and a bunch of other people. That was all fun. And one of the other things that happened along the way is when I would say I'm doing AI, people would say, oh, what the heck is that? I mean, why aren't you doing something more interesting? Can't you do databases? Can't you do software engineering? And then suddenly everybody is actually an expert in AI. And in fact, as you can see, that the fastest things, and I say, Earth really is like people becoming experts in AI. And in fact, I keep saying, by the way, I will show a bunch of tweets because I spend a bunch of time on my Twitter writing both technically important stuff as well as crazy, funny, what I think funny stuff. So as I say, like I tell my intro AI students, the demand for AI experts without any AI background has never been greater. Okay, right? And so one interesting thing is if everybody wants to be an expert, the teacher in me says perhaps everybody must be taught a bit of AI. Okay, so this is where I started saying, it's not just classroom. I love classroom teaching. I love the fact that I'm in front of you in real people, and it's like a time commitment you made. It means a lot. But still, it's also the case that you want to reach people who actually think that they're experts in AI. In fact, I don't know if Mike Woolridge is here. I just told this from him. He's one of the winners of this award too. And he basically, in his talk, he basically said, one of the reasons he decided to talk to the public about AI is if you don't talk to the public about AI, then someone who knows even less than you will be talking about AI. There is demand. So certainly I know a little more than some of the other people, and so I thought I should be talking to people. And so this is actually where that Hill kind of column started. I wrote a bunch of them, what just happened on AI, and perception won't be reality, and deep fakes, why are artificial intelligence systems biased, will AI get along with us, and also broad and shallow AI, and then beauty, lies, and ChatGPT, welcome to the post-truth world. These were, again, I tried to write it in such a way that I can be proud if really critical friends of mine read them and don't make me don't cringe that I wrote this stuff. So that was very important for me. It has to be written in English and a good English, but I also wanted to make sure that it was as close to technically correct as you can potentially do. I talked to a whole bunch of people in these various papers, etc., the news reports. I find that sometimes teaching reporters is also a very important thing, and oftentimes I spend like an hour. I know that you can get, in this day and age for AI, if you talk to somebody about AI for an hour, you should ask for at least $800 to $10,000 consultancy fee. I do it free because that's a useful thing. So if they learn what is important, what's not important, maybe some sound bites will come out of it. One of the most interesting, satisfying things to me that happened on this age thing is that I speak Telugu. I'm from India and I speak Telugu. I know that you can't tell from my accent or my dress, but I'm from India. One Telugu TV show actually, recorded like a very nice 1 hour interview with me, and then that's my parents sitting and watching them on the home TV. So, what the heck, I mean, they're not here, you're here, I'm happy for you, and I'm happy that you are here, but, it actually meant a lot to me that I got to reach that too. Okay, so anyway, then I also, as you could see already, I've been, on the Twitter, mostly because, again, it's another way of reaching people. Lots of people are reading, and lots of the first inklings of any new things come on Twitter, so you have to be there. Twitter is like America. That amazing things, they're pretty questionable things. Okay, and you don't leave America. You basically, deal with both of them. And so anyway, that's what I do. And then one of the things I do every Sunday, every once in a while, in multiple Sundays, I wake up. My wife goes up to office, and I then sit at home and try to write something that I want to talk about. And I call them Sunday harangues. And there's a whole bunch of them. Last year, for example, I wrote, I think, about 10 or 12 of those. And they're actually pretty technical stuff. For example, that's on the MDP formulations of DeepSeek R1. That is about whether or not reasoning traces in DeepSeek R1 actually should be seen as reasoning traces. We'll get back to this again. And that's about whether there is a question of stone soup and ship of thesis kind of an issue with LLMs claims about reasoning. So those are the kind of things I wind up writing. And I also did a couple of these machine learning street talk interviews that seem to have, they're not as popular as my alpha beta pruning. I mean, alpha beta pruning, it just spikes up just before midterms, guys. Because I actually talk, if there's something that can be said in 2 minutes, I tend to say it in 30 to 40 minutes. Except this one, for some reason, I recorded like a 5-minute one, and people just love it, that they could just get done in 5 minutes and understand what alpha beta pruning is. Anyway, but while that's not as popular as this too has been seen by a fair number of people. So that's about my teaching adventures. So then now I want to talk about something about, I already talking a little bit about AI, a little bit about teaching AI, etc. So I want to talk a little bit more about my perspectives on what's going on right now. Clearly, there is some technical stuff. There's also some actual personal opinions, and you should be able to make out, you're all technical audience. So let me just see this. Yeah. Okay, so as I said, one of the funny things about AI is full of pendulum swings. This was actually a 2016 talk, and AAAI 2016, and where will the AI pendulum swing next? So the AI pendulum is swinging between symbols and neurons, logic and probability, replace and augment, and of course disappointment and doomsday. This has been going on for a while. Even in that place, where we are currently is a pretty interesting, amazing time. You keep wondering, do you need this dweeb's textbook, Stuart Russell and Peter Norvik's textbook, when you have AI prompt engineering for dummies, right? Do you even need this? Do you just want to start Intro to AI course by just doing AI prompt engineering? Because there are all these systems, and we just ask them to do it, right? So I want to kind of give you a sense of why it is important, in what ways there are synergies between what gets taught in a normal Intro to AI course and what is currently happening. Of course, what's currently happening is becoming part of the Intro to AI course. It doesn't have to completely replace it, is my point. And again, I'm not looking for affirmative action for the old ideas. I want to tell you that they're actually very important because in multiple ways, Intro to AI introduces people to normative basis for understanding a whole bunch of ideas such as what is reasoning, what is the test time versus training time, computational trade-offs, and so on and so forth, which people who just come directly into prompt engineering might have to either reinvent or miss. And I'll try to make those points to you. So in doing this, actually, I found a very interesting quote. I was looking up Pat Winston, stories about Pat Winston, and Rana Khalifa, one of his students, basically put after I put up my about this award, that she was his student, and that in fact she put a pointer to an interesting story about him, and that story had the following thing, that his philosophy, that first you tell a story that's very simplified and wrong, then you refine it, so you have a succession of refined lies, and that's how you teach. I didn't know that he had that in mind, but I certainly have it in mind. I try to first get the intuition across and then try to improve the intuition. Otherwise, we will teach people in first standard quantum mechanics until they get it or die trying. Instead of telling them all these other things, including Rutherford and Chadwick models, because you do have to give the wrong theories first a bit. So keep that in mind. Some of these are actually very technical and very come to the current state of affairs, and some of them are actually probably somewhat partial theories, and you may want to tweak it. One other thing that actually Pat Winston said, and this is actually the only time I saw him in person, only from very behind in the audience. In 1999, AAAI was held in Orlando, and Pat Winston was one of the invited speakers. And the one thing that I remember him saying, and that struck in my head for quite a long time, even now, of course, that he basically pointed out, and this was 1999, remember, that in most engineering disciplines, and I'm quoting from memory because there were no YouTube videos at that time, in most engineering disciplines, raw materials place constraints on the complexity of the artifacts that can be designed. You can't design an actual building that reaches the moon, even though you can dream about it. Strength of materials won't allow it, right? However, that's not the case for computer science, where the software artifact we design can be of arbitrary complexity. He was saying this in 1999, and we are actually seeing it in action right now. We have these huge, complicated software artifacts that we're training on large amounts of data with zillions of parameters, and are trying to figure out what are they doing. And this issue of engineering being trying to design something for a function has been replaced by let's try to see what it does. So this is like we are zoologists, except doing ersatz natural science. These are like interesting kinds of software artifacts, and you try to say, well, I'll poke it with this prompt and see what happens, and see if I can write a NeurIPS workshop paper or a NeurIPS big paper. And sometimes you actually are learning something about this. Sometimes also the problem with computer science is we don't have empirical disciplines. Some of these zoologists, some of these biologists, they've essentially had a lot more of an empirical discipline. And so we tend to see, as soon as we find a certain capability for a particular prompt, we're extremely happy, we write a paper right away. But in fact, in the empirical disciplines, you have to see when will it actually fail. In fact, as we'll mention in a minute, you heard of the word jagged intelligence. Jagged intelligence essentially is this idea that these systems, some of these pre-trained systems, especially the LLMs, show amazing capabilities on certain things and die ignoble deaths on very small perturbations to the same prompts. And it's extremely hard to tell when they work, when they don't work, especially if you don't know the answer. If you know the answer, it's one thing. But I don't know how many people check Google to find out whether Google knows what they already know. That might be an interesting way to live, but that's a very weird thing to do. You typically ask Google for stuff that you can trust. And so jagged intelligence is basically an interesting issue that we have to deal with. And we are actually in this ersatz natural science kind of a thing. And so the things that I find useful in teaching students about how to put everything together is what I'm trying to do right now is, one, again, this should be not surprising at all to people here, that trends in AI technology, I basically try to tell them that we started from explicit knowledge tasks originally, and now we are increasingly more interested in tacit knowledge tasks. And then also, we used to be interested in reasoning from specifications in the beginning of Intro to AI times. But now we went Dante to learning from data, only to realize that actually reasoning is important, and we have to add reasoning back to these system one type things. So that's one of the big trends that I talk about. And the other one I talk about is we went from deep and narrow to broad and shallow systems. Deep and narrow systems with guarantees such as AlphaGo and Deep Blue, etc., to broad and shallow systems, which we currently have, which can answer pretty much any kind of a prompt, but not much, there's no a priori guarantee. And similarly, we went from from a machine learning perspective at least, we went from discriminative classification systems to generative systems. And it's important, especially this crowd will understand here, that generative systems learn the distribution of the data. If you're just doing generative learning, then you're learning the distribution of the data. And certain properties like style are distributional properties. Certain other properties like correctness are individual properties. And so it's easier to get the style than the correctness for some of these systems that we will see again and again. And so I point this out up front so that people kind of know approximately what to expect. Okay, one other thing that I show in the intro AI classes to again put in the same sort of an issue. Again, I'm trying to tell you like what I do, because that's partly presumably why you asked me to talk here. So that I basically try to say that AI went from inference focused to inference or reasoning focused to learning focused systems over certainly my lifetime. And it's again going from learning focused back to reasoning. That's more of the things that we'll be discussing today. So we basically, inference focused systems tend to say, start by assuming that the models are available and then focus on the inference that in the context of that model that has guarantees. This is the kind of stuff that you learn, for example, in some of the earlier chapters of the Intro to AI, if you're still doing Intro to AI. Okay, it sort of tends to postpone learning, and it's great for explicit knowledge domains where somebody can actually have given you these models. You say that you will find out some way of learning the models, but you don't talk about it. In the old Intro to AI courses, you barely ever cared about where the models were coming. The learning focused one basically says, let's assume that, admit that agent doesn't have any a priori models and focus on learning even primitive models representations. And so basically you'll start with the typically reflex agents which learn broad and shallow knowledge about areas, whether narrow or broad areas. This one postpones inference. That's exactly what happened with ChatGPT. You postponed inference towards system one level abilities. And now in the reasoning models, we are actually trying to see how to add the reasoning on top of the system one capabilities. So the significant recent focus here, especially in LLMs, this is mostly for at least the standard LLMs are reflex agents. And the exciting part that we'll talk a little bit about is this reasoning models directions that are going on and how is that trying to combine and whether it's the right way to combine them. So you should, if it's an Intro to AI talk, an AI talk these days, you have to say system one and system two. And I keep telling my students, please don't dissect any human brain to look for where the system one is and system two is, because this is not, it's obviously a psychological, it's a metaphorical statement about how brain might be working. But from the perspective of system one, system two, that I don't need to explain to people here, I would argue that the inference focused systems are focusing mostly on system two. And the learning focus, the LLMs in particular, have been focusing on system one. In fact, one way of being really excited about LLMs is they were the first working system ones that we ever had. And they are basically broad system ones that basically can answer reasonably for many, many kinds of prompts. And that wound up being an extremely useful thing. That's part of their this thing. As I said, however, with that comes when is it correct, when is it not correct. Because you don't have the system to think, there are no guarantees essentially. You're giving an answer which may have been affected by the content effects, because after all, again, LLMs are trained on the entire digital footprints of the humanity. And so they may very well have seen certain kinds of problems and their answers beforehand, and then maybe not the ones that are next to it. And that's why they will work on some things and not work on other things. And then, so large language models are really quite amazing, and I really am happy that they're there, but they also seem to kick our anthropomorphization tendencies into high gear. Okay, and again, I say, I mean, not so much, but in some of my talks, I point out that if, when I wind up talking about things like whether standard LLMs have planning abilities, etc., which we'll talk a little bit in a minute, that please don't think of me as some kind of an LLM, right? I think LLMs are great, but I also think alchemy is great in the following sense. Chemistry as an area is an amazing area. It was a bunch of bozos thinking chemistry can also do nuclear physics if only you prompt it the right way, had led to some problems, right? So that is something that you want to keep in. By the way, this one is the most recent, I think 01 or 03, and somebody keeps showing this if you live in Twitter enough, saying, for example, this is a particular polygon and how many sides does it have, and it basically says there are 10, okay? And that doesn't make any sense, obviously, but on the other hand, this is a system that also wins Math Olympiad problems. So this is where this whole issue of jagged intelligence comes. That's why I couldn't resist saying it's a jagged polygon, y'all, because there are obviously small sides that you are not able to see. Anyway, anthropomorphization sin is an original sin in AI. You know this, right? Drew McDermott, basically an amazing guy, wrote this paper, I think in the 70s, on artificial intelligence meets natural stupidity. And you should read this, and you should make your students read it, because we are repeating some of those, and it's something that we always have an issue with, because after all, the one thing that we know is intelligent is us, and then we think pretty much everything is somehow anthropomorphized. I mean, ELIZA effect is another way of looking at it. So the anthropomorphization sin has kind of kicked into high gear with LLMs. So I have fun basically pointing out some of these things in what I call AI aphorisms that you might want to look at if you have no other work. But one of the bigger points I want to make about this, how anthropomorphization sin becomes an issue in LLM style systems, is with respect to style versus content and form versus factuality. Again, the standard LLMs basically are generative AI in general, capture the distribution of the data they are trained on, and the style is a distributional property. Whereas factuality, facts and correctness is an individual property. And so civilizationally, we had always thought style is harder than content. But suddenly with LLMs, style is easy. You can write, anybody can write. If you get a poem from your boyfriend or girlfriend, you're no longer impressed, because after all, they use ChatGPT. Okay, in in like 2000 or something, when my students wrote a little poem, I was impressed because they actually put together some rhyming words. Now it's just all ChatGPT. Correctness, on the other hand, is a different kind of a property. It's not a distributional property. So you'll wind up finding errors that they make. Other thing I mention for the students when I'm talking about LLMs is LLMs, after all, are a sort of an n-gram models, and they do not index and retrieve. They are not actually databases. In fact, databases are probably boring, but they'll always be correct. If they give you an answer, they're always correct, because that's the stuff that you put in the database. But LLMs, all they do ever is hallucinate completions to the prompt, such that the completion is in the same distribution as the text they have been trained on, and sometimes their answer winds up, their hallucination winds up aligning with your reality, and you say, wow, that's great, LLM is great. Okay, so prompt engineering typically doesn't change it, so it's very useful to understand that. There are a whole bunch of papers that have actually come out as well as gotten disproved because the prompt engineering per se itself doesn't necessarily change it, especially when you don't know the answer. So in fact, as I said, unless you're using ChatGPT to check whether ChatGPT knows the answers to the question you know the answers to already, such as that polygon problem, if it gave an answer to some very complicated physics problem, and you don't know what physics is, God help you, right? Right, essentially. So that's why, one of my most famous contributions, presumably, and I don't have any startups, so I actually make T-shirts with that and sell. I didn't wear it this time. That the impressive reasoning abilities of LLMs would basically depend on prompter knowing the answer. And now that we have deep research, you can actually remove reasoning and say impressive research abilities of LLMs are dependent on prompter knowing the answer. You would see, if you're on Twitter, people showing that certain big research articles that deep research wrote, once they actually go through it, sometimes can have errors. Sometimes they don't, but sometimes they do. And if I just tell you, here is something that sometimes may be right, sometimes may be wrong, and you don't know what the correct answer is, you should be very careful. And we should also make sure that our students know that. So anyway, so the other thing is that part of the reason this happens is LLMs approximate retrieval sort of upends our intuitions regarding their guesses. One of the things that are actually useful from an intro to AI perspective is we do care about computational complexity of different classes of problems. And you know that if you have two different, my classic example for my students is, if you have two different prompts to an LLM, normal LLM, which has one corresponds to like a constant time or a polynomial time computation, another corresponds to semi-decidable computation, and you hit return, it starts giving the answer. What happened to the computational complexity? The only way you could have done it is, in fact, if you have actually retrieved it. If you are solving it from scratch in any, and which you would have to do sometimes, then it actually has to spend online time. I understand that some of you are thinking, yes, we have test time scaling, etc. I will talk about that in a minute, but I want you to think in terms of this particular standard LLMs thing. And also the other thing that's great about these is their background knowledge is easier for LLMs. That's something that has been a big problem for us. They'll give you approximate background knowledge and pretty much anything about common sense, about domain knowledge, about theory of mind, about analogies, all without guarantees. So they can generate code, which is pretty complicated. And one of the interesting things that we'll see in a minute is, if they are used to generate, and then you have a generate test framework with a tester, and for code, testing will be unit tests. That will actually improve the overall system's guarantees. That's one of the things that we do, and that's actually a version of test time scaling, as we'll see in a minute. So anyway, I do planning. Before LLMs came along, I used to do planning, and so one of the things I checked is whether LLMs actually do planning. This was a while back, and this was a NeurIPS 23 paper basically showing that the claims about ChatGPT doing planning are basically questionable. I would say bogus, but I'll just say questionable. And then, so they were actually, in particular, one of the things that they were doing is, you want to check whether they're able to retrieve, they're able to reason, or they're actually retrieving. Because anything within the era of LLMs, data contamination is a feature, not a bug, because everything has been looked at in the end. And so one question is, can we check whether they're actually able to do the same problem? And again, this guy, Drew McDermott, one of the very smart people that I had the privilege to know, basically came up with this idea for planning competition, international planning competition, that some people are writing domain-specific planners, they make sure that they can fail, that they're not actually doing domain-specific things by changing the names of the object. So for example, instead of picking up a block and stacking, etc., you say attack an object, feast an object from another object, succumb an object, overcome something, etc. And it's the exact same dynamics of the planning problem. Any classical planner will solve each of them exactly in the same amount of time, but LLMs die, basically. Because they don't actually, they tend to depend more on the standard LLMs for sure die, because they tend to depend on the retrieval capabilities. And we also showed, for example, in NeurIPS 24, there's work showing that chain of thought generalizes a bit, but not enough. In particular, chain of thought in its most interesting form would be advice taking. And some of you might know this guy called John McCarthy, who said one of the goals of AI is advice taking programs. And so I didn't realize that somehow chain of thought had already solved it. So I was kind of skeptical. So I checked. And if you learn a procedure, essentially, you should be able to solve the procedure, for any number of unrolls, and you'll find that even something as simple as last data concatenation, which is that one at the bottom, if you give a chain of thought example, it does well for a few, the size of the problems for which you gave the example, and as the number of words increase, its accuracy collapses. And this is as simple a procedure as you can get, and you'll still have the problem with that. And then, so one of the other interesting things is you can do fine-tuning, and fine-tuning improves. You can convert reasoning into retrieval by fine-tuning on a set of problems that you have access to, so that you might, actually give more of the correct answers in a certain distribution. People have tried this, but one thing I want us to remember is fine-tuning should be taken into account with the general computational trade-offs. You know, as a computer scientist, that you can solve all the problems and remember their answers, and then answer them in constant time later on, right? So the reason why we didn't do it is because it's too costly. And so the question is, who is currently checking whether or not the fine-tuning that you did has made up for the generalization it's actually doing in the distribution. And by the one of the other things that I find is the word generalization. In my time in AI, the word generalization has got so diluted that it's embarrassing. And so, in fact, people say that generalizing, but oftentimes they might be generalizing that you did some 3-word problems and it did some other 3-word problems. But I want more interesting generalization, which involves 10 words, etc. And in general, I think inverses out of distribution, which machine learning people tend to think about, and your students will know about. Basically, is kind of less relevant than the question of whether of the deductive closure. That is the system actually able to answer all the queries in the deductive closure? If it is able to reason, it should be able to. And that's basically the point that is made in the last letter concatenation problem. Actually, this was just a funny thing that one of the interesting things is that the hype in the area in general, and it's reducing thankfully, is so high that one time I wrote this, and I request you to read this abstract, which includes sentences, beautiful sentences like, we prove by reduction to Rube Goldberg machines that the fuzzy jumbled thoughts prompting eventually makes LLM solve any problem for which the prompting graduate students know the answer. And unfortunately, this is close to reality in several papers that are published in pretty high quality conferences. And that's the problem. When you are on the bubble, you don't realize that you're on the bubble. And so somebody else who's kind of churlish should actually be looking at it. One of the other things, of course, is LLMs are as knowledge-based knowledge sources. This is a great connections with Intro to AI, a concept from the older times, because normal Intro to AI basically would say domain expertise. You have to kind of interview people, and then you write it into some formal representation, and then you give it to your reasoning machine reasoning process. LLMs basically semi-automate a whole bunch of it. That's how you can generate code, that's how you can generate domain models, that's how you can generate pretty much anything, but without guarantees. And that's a very useful thing. You might say that, is it cost effective? Well, it's cost effective for you because Sam Altman already paid for it, so I don't mind using it for that. Okay, so in fact, this is a NeurIPS paper, NeurIPS 2023 paper, saying that LLMs constructing domain models for planning, basically we use LLMs to construct domain models for planning domains without instead of having humans write the domain models, we have them guess, and then humans do partial work in improving them. And sometimes you can also do partial verification with automated solvers. So those are the kinds of things that are very useful to do. In general, I actually think that one of the good things that the LLM revolution has brought is that there was a bit of a craziness, especially in areas like deep reinforcement learning, that they went into, we don't want to take anything from the end user. We want to guess everything by search on the world. And except they don't mean really world, they mean simulator. And I don't know where simulators grow on trees. If you find any simulator growing on trees on the way, let me know. There's a flower show going on, maybe they're blooming there. But in general, somebody wrote the simulator, so they actually know the domain models. And one of the interesting things is, if you had this problem about taking knowledge from the humans, LLMs make it much simpler because it's not human anymore. It is collective human knowledge that we have essentially trained this LLM on. And then now it can provide some approximate version of it. So you get to say, Mom, I didn't ask any humans. I didn't touch any humans in getting these knowledge models. And in general, that also means that much more effective methods are actually possible for both reinforcement learning and planning kinds of things, because knowledge is actually a way you can improve the inference speed in many cases. So that's actually a very useful thing. Again, this is discussed a lot more in that ML tutorial, ICML tutorial, but I'm just going to do it once. Now I want to get into the rest of the time, the thing that some of you are obviously very interested in saying, Rao is talking about the standard LLMs. I understand 90% of the world is still using standard LLMs, but there is all this O1 and O3 and O7 or O19, which none of us know what actually they work. But thankfully, there's this Chinese company with DeepSeek, which has R1, which is approximately of the same, competitive to O1, which actually did write a paper as to what they're doing. And so I want to tell you a little bit about my perspective. I've been spending time, and we have a perspective paper coming out on this. So I want to give you a sense of, with respect to what I said in this talk, how do those actually come into place? Test time inference, the two important things. If you just have a generator, which is what LLMs are, system one generators, and you want them to solve reasoning problems, there are two things you can do. One is put them in a generate test hybrid framework. So they will generate, somebody says, try it again, the following is wrong, try it again, this particular step is wrong, etc. And this generate test is with the verification thrown into the line. And one of the weird ways people think about test time inference is to say LLMs are talking too soon. As soon as you hit return, they start giving answers. We know that people who solve harder problems seem to be taking more time, so do programs. Maybe we'll make LLMs take more time. There are actually papers that were written saying pause as part of the prompt. So I can't make this up. You have to read this stuff. This is real stuff, right? And so the interesting thing, of course, is actually pause can actually work sometimes, and there are technical reasons why it works, and it's very important to understand why those might work. But that's test time inference. And then the other aspect is improving generated by post-training, and I want to talk about both of them before ending. So test time scaling, it basically brings back system 2 AI ideas to system 1 LLMs, really speaking. In fact, suddenly, if you look at the people in the reasoning models community, they're all including people like Noam Brown, basically act as if test time scaling is such an interesting idea. Well, it's only interesting for LLMs because they came from system 1 side. Okay, if you're looking at Intro to AI, for example, you know that chess as well as Go, originally, before AlphaGo time, used to be all test time inference. No pre-training, right? And you would wind up doing either limited death min-max or MCT or something which will actually try to do online inference. The interesting part is how can you cut down the online inference? So we went completely to the other end, which is a system 1. And then now you're trying to add, the reason system 1 will not always work, which is why we do have a system 2, is that we may not have the ability to remember answer to every possible reasoning problem. And so you are essentially bringing inference time computation back into the fold. Except your Intro to AI students know a whole bunch of those things already, if they were paying attention. And making that connection makes them very happy, because it's always nice to know that things are actually connected. So the spectrum of ideas for test time scaling includes something as simple as calling LLM to answer the same question like 18,000 times, 18 times, 25 times, especially if it's a yes-no answer, then take the majority vote and hope for the best. And sometimes it actually does improve accuracy under certain distributional considerations. You can even show why it might actually be improving. The other lot more useful thing, I think, that at least I'm interested in is the verifiers in the generate test framework. And that basically, to the extent verifiers are actually correct, are sound for even a partial part, they'll wind up giving you guarantees. So this is the stuff that we've been doing on LLM modulo. I don't want to go into all the details. There are actual talks on this. But I want to show you that essentially LLM becomes like a generator, and there's a bank of critiques or bank of verifiers. Some of them may be actually sound and complete. Some of them may be style critiques. Some of them may actually be learned critiques, so they only have probabilistic guarantees. And some of them may even be LLM-based critiques, for which there is even less guarantees. But then you can actually use this in a generate test framework to increase the time that you spend until you get to a point where you are happy with the solution. So that's basically the way LLM modulo works. So one of the interesting things is with this kind of a situation, the verifiers actually can guarantee soundness and completeness. And one of the interesting things in the Intro to AI, for plans, for diagnosis, for probabilistic reasoning, we actually teach verifiers. There is a computational theory of what makes a plan correct. There's a computational theory of what makes a diagnosis correct. And so normally we tended to have the verifier and also invert the verifier, make it into a solver and do search. In the generate test framework, generator actually generates the candidates and the verifier only has to check. Now you know that intro to AI, generate test is the dumbest idea that you basically poo-poo in the beginning. But generate test is a good idea if a generator is a rich uncle who knows everything. Okay, and that's actually what happens with LLMs. While they are not completely random guessers, they do actually have, they've been trained on, with respect to that, unless there is training data contamination, they tend to have higher density of correct solutions potentially than just random guess, and so generate test frameworks will work in those cases. And then anyway, there are different kinds of critics, as I mentioned, which can be even LLM based. And one thing I do want to mention in passing, that LLMs by themselves, if they can't plan, you might think maybe they can verify. This is a bad analogy. You think because verification is typically lower complexity than planning, and search verification lower complexity, so maybe LLM can do it. No, LLMs can't do last letter concatenation. Not the standard LLMs can't do last letter concatenation even, right? And so they can't do verification correctly either. So there's an iClear paper that actually, it's been around for a while, but it's showing up in iClear this year, which basically shows that sometimes when LLMs are actually required to verify the problems for which you know the correct solution, their overall performance reduces instead of increasing, because oftentimes the verifier actually might be giving false positives as well as false negatives. Okay, that's the spectrum of ideas for test time scaling. The other one that I want to mention before ending is that basically you're keeping the standard LLM as it is and you're trying to do test time change, right? An equivalent idea is improve the generator. In fact, one of the beautiful quotes that I unfortunately can't find exact place where Marvin Minsky said, but Jack Minker, who taught us Intro to AI at Maryland, basically told us in the class that Marvin Minsky said, and so you take it, Jack is in heaven somewhere. But anyway, Marvin Minsky said apparently that intelligence is integrating test part of the generate test into the generate part. It's a beautiful statement. You basically improve your guesses over a period of time so that you have less of a verification requirement. So if you already have a test time verification and you also improve the generative capability, your efficiency improves quite significantly. And so that is where the post-training approaches come. The interesting question about the post-training approaches is they essentially rely, especially for areas with formal verification, like things like most of the reasoning models take huge credit for math problems and for math Olympiad problems, which in a weird way is strange, because if you ask them why is an LLM failing in a 30-word last letter concatenation or 15-digit multiplication, they say, do you know any people who can do this right? But then apparently they see people doing math Olympiad problems everywhere. I don't know where these people are. Do you understand what I'm saying? You take credit where you are working and you say, otherwise I only have to do random humans can do. But I think that's not the way science should be doing. We should actually be thinking in terms of guarantees. So essentially the post-training approaches rely on the synthetic data. And interestingly, synthetic data really is compute converted into data if you have verifiers. Because you generate a problem, you search for the answer, and the verifier actually tells you whether it's correct or wrong. And then you have the solution as well as the verification, the problem as well as the solution. And this is often generated with the help, for the synthetic data, it's generated with the help of classical verifiers. That's how you actually do the rejection sampling. This is what actually R1 does. And the LLMs are fine-tuned not only on the solutions, but also on the derivational traces leading to the solutions. One interesting idea is if you can somehow make LLMs output intermediate tokens before outputting the final solution, empirically we have found that they actually improve performance. But then there is a whole entire mythology about what these derivational traces mean. People start talking about it as reasoning traces. I will show you in a minute that they're actually not necessarily reasoning traces. They give you additional amount of leeway for the LLM to actually fit to the data, is what I would think. Anyway, so in fact, for those of you who come from analogy literature, the derivational traces versus what standard LLMs are doing is derivation analogy versus transformational analogy. Okay, and then you can also do RL post-training instead of just fine-tuning. So the fine-tuning would just take problem, intermediate tokens, and the solution, where the intermediate tokens have been given either by the humans or by a classical solver, or even by one of these LLMs, and then they fine-tune them. And the R1's extra thing, which O1 I think was doing probably, we just don't know for sure, is it also uses RL training to actually pick between these traces. So they'll essentially ask the base model to come up with multiple derivational traces and the solution, and the ones that end up in the correct solution, it basically assumes that's the one has the reward, and then the RL uses policy gradient algorithm to slowly make the LLM go towards that. So one of the interesting questions is, it's not really clear to me whether RL part is as important as iterated iterated SFT, iterated supervised fine tuning. So again, as I mentioned in the data versus compute debate, it's important to remember that you can convert compute into data for at least synthetic problems. And the way you did it is from the intro to AI, because you actually need to know what makes a plan correct before you can do this, okay? So RL running on the derivational traces is just one more little thing that basically you see them, the LLM itself as a policy on the tokens, and you are essentially changing the policy gradient as against doing SFT. So the question of whether this is better or worse than SFT is not completely clear. Currently, R1 says they used it and that was one of the big reasons. But they also say that when they distilled R1's traces, after R1 has been trained, when you make it generate whole bunch more traces and check which of them are correct, and they train a smaller LLM, that's competitive. And some other people have already started pointing out that instead of a smaller LLM, if you trained a bigger LLM of the same size as R1, it is actually better than competitive. Which makes you wonder that this is a moving area where RL is a great idea. There's always large number of people who love RL. There's a cheering section for RL. I'm one of them too. But sometimes it may not be needed. RLHF is a classic case. There's no RL in RLHF, if you know what happened with DPO. So combining test time scaling and post-training is actually very much possible. Interestingly, O1 might very well be doing it. That's what I actually speculated when O1 came out back in September, which is the dark days of last year. Now, DeepSeek actually wrote a paper about what they are doing, but they don't do test time scaling. They just do simple fine-tuning and derivational traces. And so at the inference time, it's just a standard LLM that keeps outputting tokens until it reaches end of token. End of completion token. So, but you can combine both of them. And by the way, when O1 came around, Noam Brown actually quoted this, that, when I gave an ACR talk pointing out, I gave it in August, September is when O1 came out. I pointed out that some planning problems that ChatGPT couldn't do. And then he basically said, no, it actually does do that particular planning problem. And so we went and paid $8,000 of our hard-earned money to actually check how O1 does on the plan bench. It certainly does better than ChatGPT. It does quite well on the blocks world, but it's still pretty bad. Not as good, at least about 30% on the mystery domain. The other thing, of course, is DeepSeek is also kind of comparable, at least on blocks world part. And then the costs become important. It turns out we were paying $42 for this particular, that particular test, whereas you could pay $2. I mean, maybe the cost will fall down, but it's also the case that in general, test time computation is going to have a different kind of a trade-off because end users have to pay money for that. It's no longer Sam Altman already paid, I don't need to worry. Okay, so cost considerations matter. Reasoning models, especially those with test time scaling, bring to fore cost considerations, which is what we always knew in computer science. Test time scaling puts cost on the user-facing side. It can't be ignored anymore as the offline pre-training cost. So efficiency issues will start mattering. We actually also show that with O1 and DeepSeek R1, they are better generators. Just like Marvin Minsky said, they essentially are putting more of the compiled data of the verification back into the generator. So they're better generators, but they're not guaranteed. So you can actually improve O1 as well as DeepSeek R1 with, again, one more verifier in the loop, especially R1 for sure, but we also showed it for O1. And so that sort of basically tells you that for your specific domain, you can still have this verifier in the generate test loop, and you will both have guarantees and maybe higher accuracy. One last thing I want to mention is the intermediate tokens that these systems spew out have started developing a new mythos that they are reasoning traces. And because why? Because sometimes they say, sometimes they say, let me think in a different way, sometimes they will say, let me split the problem, etc. Most of the time, the reasoning traces have never been evaluated. DeepSeek R1, for example, if you run one of the planning problems, it gives a 35-page mumbling. Okay, some of which makes sense, it's in English, but it's not really correct. It just makes sense in the sense it makes English sense. The interesting point is, why do you believe that they're actually reasoning traces? There's no reason to believe it because LLMs trained on derivational traces imitate the derivational traces. Right? I mean, I had a kid, when my kid was small, he would do this hilarious thing about how to speak on the phone, walking around with the phone, making the right pauses, but gobbledygook talk. No content, but amazing intermediate tokens. Okay, so the question is, it's okay as long as accuracy improves. And in fact, most of these systems don't check whether the intermediate tokens are correct. DeepSeek R1 certainly doesn't. The only thing it does is R1.0 is almost as good, but once in a while is putting Chinese and English. So we then put extra amount of data to further fine tune it so that it will only speak English. But nobody checked whether it's correct or not. There is one small place where in fact traces can have formal meaning and you can check whether they are correct or not. That is the case where the derivational traces are generated by formal solvers. There are papers like Search Farmer and Stream of Search, both of which were published in last comb, and they basically do A-star search star of formal algorithms and just take the open closed list manipulations as the traces. Some mumblings are needed. So, and then in the test time, they will produce syntactically nice looking, let me put it on closed list, let me take it out of open list. And they say, looks good. In fact, there is a statement in one of these papers, I think Search Farmer, that they made A-star search more optimal. Ray, you should know this. A-star search has become more optimal with LLMs, which makes no sense because A-star search, for its considerations, is the most optimal you can get. What they did was, it has a shorter trace before coming to the answer than the real A-star search did. But if you actually see what the trace is gobbledygook. So that's what this one is saying. We actually looked at the traces and how many times the traces are correct with respect to A-star search and under what conditions are the problems correct. And there are cases where problem solution is correct but the trace is wrong. There are cases where problem trace is correct, the solution is wrong. What that means is solution trace is mumbling. So it may be worth remembering, I'm not saying this is true, that we went from LLMs to LMMs, which is large mumbling models. And they have higher accuracy. Okay? And so my point about this is, question things that you hear. That's the only thing that's important. Because if you're not making money, I mean, if you're making money, why are you in this room? So you should be scientists and you should be looking at the comments that are made by this thing. So in fact, the perils of reasoning traces anthropomorphization is it might give false, undeserved confidence to the end users. Just because it looks like people talking to themselves, you'll start believing the answer which you don't know whether it's correct or wrong. That's exactly the wrong thing to do. Because we have major cognitive flaws. We think people good looking like me must know what they're talking about. And you could be completely wrong. That's a cognitive flaw, right? And you want to avoid that and you should try to avoid that part. And similarly, why stick to something that is probably kind of coming from the humans talking to themselves? Why not have it talk whatever language it has? That the RL actually just optimize it for the post-facto accuracy, and you don't really care about the intermediate traces anyway, and they're already they're not guaranteed. So if you might actually improve the accuracy. So my original idea was essentially that you should really think in terms of this as a prompt augmentation with a second querying LLM asking the first base LLM with various kinds of prompts and learning what is the right kind of prompts over a long period of time. That could actually possibly work. I don't have the $800 million or $80 million to test this out, but you can test it out. Okay, so you thought I'll never end, but I did. Twitching in the AI, aging the age of LLMs, my experience has been that there is rich synergies with inference-focused AI of the traditional intro AI course in LLMs. The reason I'm so interested in following this stuff is because it makes sense to me. I think it's very impressive. I also think that some of the people doing some of that stuff should have known something more than what they already know. right? And that's what the whole research enterprise, teaching enterprise is. Viewing LLMs as a first effective system on approximators with inference-focused AI approaches as system 2 has been useful. And please try to resist anthropomorphization sins and teach your students also that, because you will never get anywhere by just saying it looks like human, it looks like a plant. That's not enough. Style is important, but correctness is not directly connected to spacing. So I'm going to end there. So I talked a little about the teaching advantages and more about my perspectives on AI and LLMs in the age of teaching AI in the age of LLMs. And thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to take any questions if you have. Okay. Are you having any questions? Yes. Yes. Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you so much for this talk. There's so much to follow up on.
It's been recorded, so you can watch it. But anyway, please do. Yeah.
That's actually wonderful to hear. And I'll probably put it in ChatGPT to have the structured notes.
Yeah, please don't do it.
So
It gives you false confidence. But go ahead. Yeah.
What I wanted to ask you is, I agree with, I follow a lot of what you say, and I agree with a lot of it. But I wanted to ask you, do you ever have second thoughts about using the word anthropomorphism? Anthropomorphism has a lot of history behind it, which is it's a word that humans use to put everything away from them.
Mm-hmm.
So anthropomorphization has been used to sort of like ignore animals' consciousness and cognition for a very long time, and that is now changing. Now one of the most exciting things about AI is that we think we can now decrypt the language of whales and start to understand what they're talking about. So what I'm saying is that anthropomorphism has been used as a way to deny other species their agency and their cognition. So I'm not saying that.
First of all, I think
I'm not saying that this is happening now.
No, but
do you have any compunctions?
No, actually, as I was saying towards the end of my talk, I said, let LLMs be LLMs. Let their intermediate tokens be in Swahili or actually a language, whale language. And I want to see if, in fact, it improves the performance, because that's the only thing we can actually evaluate. We are not evaluating the mumbling spot, right? So that part is for sure. And the second part, of course, is I meant it. I mean, I understand your point, and I respect that. All I was saying is, there was this wrong tendency to kind of give human-like characteristics to AI systems that hasn't served that sort of slowed down the field in different times, from Drew McDermott's times to now, and you should be aware of it. And sometimes it can be a positive thing. As I was saying, in fact, why try to be like humans if, in fact, the reasoning traces are not actually going to have any semantics? The answer, you do care about the semantics, so you're going to check. But the mumbling traces don't necessarily have to, and that might actually help. Yeah.
Thank you for that lecture. Follow up to that question. How much of the mumbling traces or anthropomorphization aside do you think are necessary, except if you seem to be suggesting that they are more kept there for appearing to be faking?
No, I don't think most.
They learned that behavior based on how humans tend to think or do when they are thinking. So is that the point that you're making?
Yeah, so my point is, first of all, let me make it very, very clear. I don't believe anybody in the research is trying to cheat the system. Nobody that I've actually, the parts that I mentioned. So that's not what I'm saying. Oftentimes you can delude yourself without realizing. That's the problem. And so the question is, it's not that. It does look more in the style of maybe potential human stalking, but first I would want you to realize that we don't actually know what it means for humans to think their way to solution. Much of it is actually not cognitively accessible to ourselves. In fact, you have seen this for a different way before. When Deep Blue won, all the chess champions said, that's not exactly how we think. We think very differently. But tough luck. You lost the game, right? Essentially, start thinking in DeepSeek way, Deep Blue way. So my point essentially is that it wasn't clear whether the mumblings are really helping. And if you know the history, history is a loaded word because it's 1.5 years worth of history. And there's a perspective paper coming out that also gives those two pictures that I have would be described more. It actually came from the fact that we needed intermediate tokens, and people have tried intermediate tokens of any kind, including those from people. Originally, OpenAI tried to have, like Nigerians, give step-by-step solutions. It was too costly. Now, most of the time, what they do is they have LLMs themselves can generate the intermediate tokens, partly because the pre-training data has derivational traces. Original web didn't. In fact, it's a very good, well-known thing that Gauss, people went to Carl Friedrich Gauss and said, man, why don't you give the intuition behind your proofs? And Gauss said, no self-respecting architect leaves the support structure in place after the building is done. That's basically how we had web. We wrote the solutions, not the derivational traces. But in the last 2 years or so, because of the chain of thought, etc., people started putting more data, which became part of the pre-training data. So if you look carefully at the DeepSeek, the intermediate tokens are being generated by the base LLM. Okay? And then all RL tries to do is basically, our SFT tries to do is do rejection sampling on those traces that end in the solution and those traces that don't end in the solution. And the ones that end in the solution, it actually gives basically RL to go forward. Okay? My point is, and then many of the times when RL starts changing these sorts of things, eventually there is no actual meaning. Even if there was one before, there is no meaning later on. And people know this. It is really a question of, that's why you're only checking the correctness of the answer, not the correctness of the mumbles. Okay? And, originally O1, when it came out, had a very smart idea. I don't know whether they did it for the reasons that, are nefarious or not. They said, we are thinking, but we won't show you our thinking. We will charge you for our thinking. This is exactly like lawyers. We thought, and you have to pay money. And the question, of course, is if they actually poured all their thinking out, maybe it will look like what DeepSeek is doing. I really, really respect what DeepSeek guys did, because it's a big system that was open source, that is actually written papers on. We still don't know the data they've trained on. It's not OMO that the AI2 does. We want to get there finally, but this is way better than O1. So I'm trying to ignore Pat, but that's what it is. Yeah, Pat, please.
AI in the era.
This is how you teach AI, because you come to.
Do you believe, for example, do you believe that we should not be teaching classic AI?
No, I mean, you are not listening to me. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. So my whole point is things that I teach. First of all, the way there's a point I wanted to make about the technique of teaching. When students come to your intro to AI class today, they have heard about ChatGPT. They have heard about diffusion models. Trying to tell them, don't think about it for the rest of the semester while I'll go on and on about other stuff and I'll only come to these towards the end of the semester, you lost the audience. My way of doing it is to tell them what they came to hear, tell them why they need to know more. That's exactly what I was trying to do in this talk too, essentially. And that's what happens if you look at my actual Intro to AI course, I basically start with LLMs and start with what the things that I came to hear about, and then tell them why they need to know this other stuff, because otherwise they're likely to repeat the mistakes. And that's the way to teach, at least that's my view.
Thank you very much. On behalf of our audience, I want to thank you one more time for your outstanding and long-standing.
Thank you.